honestly, as a therapist, as a psychologist, you can't help people do work you haven't done yourself. Quickly came to wrestle with the idea that people do the best that they can with what they know and where they are in life. I guess I need to give up that dream of having a camp for kids that were high risk. Like I held that for a decade. Like the brain can heal, the body can heal from trauma. Yeah, it's kind of amazing.
Hi, this is Pat, and you are listening to the I Used to Think podcast, a podcast about the stories of people who are brave enough to change their mind. This is episode 10. A lot has happened over these past few months in my personal life, including the fact that I just got married, and so that accounts for the delay in getting this episode out. But today I am looking forward to presenting today's conversation. It is with my friend Maria. Now, I met Maria through a camp for youth in foster care in Los Angeles County. I've been volunteering through Maria's organization, Dawn of Hope, for just over 5 years now, and I believe this year will be my 4th time volunteering at the camp. Maria is a licensed therapist, and in this episode, she shares with us her story about starting her career and moving to California. She talks about the beginnings of camp and how she initially got the vision to start a camp for at-risk kids in the city. She also gives us insight into brain development and how even through the most traumatic experiences, the brain and the body will always find the way to heal itself. Now, before we start the episode, I have a few requests. Please consider contributing financially to camp. Camp begins next week, and there are still expenses that still need to be covered so that the kids can have an incredible week. I've included the link to contribute in the description of this episode. In addition, we are also still looking for a camp nurse who can provide medical care during the week if need be. For more information and the criteria to be a volunteer, please reach out to me. If you're in Southern California and able to fill that need, that would be a huge help. Maria will talk more about camp and again about the history and the vision behind camp. So without further ado, let's get started. Maria, welcome to the podcast. I'm really glad to have you
Awesome.
here. As you
Thank you.
mentioned earlier in your call, you are talking in front of the entire world.
Yeah, it feels like that.
This is my first chance to give an introduction, as I said earlier, for an expert. And I say that because to me, you are one. So today I'm speaking with Maria. I met her through a foster camp that I started volunteering in actually the end of my first year of college. And it has been, as we were talking earlier on a phone call, one of the constants in my life. Foster camp has been so impactful for me. Maria has, let me know if I get this right, a master's in marriage and family therapy, as
Mhm.
well as a PhD from Fuller in clinical psychology.
I have a PsyD, which is a slight difference, but the
Okay.
PhDs would care.
Okay. Got it. Got it.
Yeah, so I have a PsyD in clinical psychology from Fuller.
Okay. And if I remember correctly, I think I saw a Facebook post. Did you just complete that last year?
Mm-mm. No, I finished that in 2015,
Okay.
but because I was licensed as a marriage and family therapist, I delayed completing my licensure process as a clinical psychologist.
Okay. Got
Yeah.
it.
So I got licensed as a clinical psychologist last year.
Do you feel a difference now that you've completed that?
I yes and no, actually. Not really. And also the licensing exam for that is kind of a beast. So that was a huge sense of accomplishment because
Okay.
it's long, kind of like it's as expansive as like the bar, you know.
Okay. Wow.
So it felt like a big accomplishment.
And to continue with Maria's background, she is currently a director of counseling for an after-school program and trains
Mm-hmm.
other mentors and counselors.
Mm-hmm.
So, Maria, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the episode. Oh, I will add one more actually. I wrote down here a Northwestern girl who has fallen in love with LA.
Yeah, that's very true.
So I will end
Definitely
with
from the
that.
Pacific Northwest that loves LA.
So there is a host of things I want to get touch on this episode, including even a quick shout out about foster camp and how that started and how people can get involved. Planning to do that at the end, but let's start with the icebreaker. And I think it goes with today's topic of adolescence and I guess childhood development. For you, Maria, thinking back to your childhood, when summer was approaching, whether it's elementary school or middle school, what is the one thing you always looked forward to about summer? And it could be
Hmm.
seeing a certain relative, it could be the grass smelled different. What would that be?
Yeah, good question. And like so ironic because I'm actually in my home that I grew up in, visiting family doing this. So even better. I always looked forward to swimming
Okay.
or playing at the river. Where I grew up, there was a river that ran through our city. And so you would just like float the river, hang out at the river, that kind of thing.
Okay. Would you do it with cousins, friends, siblings?
Sometimes all of the above, right? So we go with friends. When I was younger, I would go with like my family, my uncle. We'd go down to like the riverbank and we would like have a little campfire. We'd roast marshmallows and hot dogs and play at the river, just different things. So, and then when I got older, I always would float the river with my friends. And when I was in high school, speaking of adolescence in high school, I worked a movie theater
Okay.
and we would go float the river, then go to work as a group of friends, which was super fun.
Meaning you float the river early morning?
Yeah. So it takes like a couple hours and we wouldn't have to be to work until later in the day,
Okay.
like 3 maybe. So you had enough time to like float the river, shower, get to work.
Growing up in the suburbs of Southern California, that is so foreign to me. I just, I,
Yeah.
to me, that sounds like something out of where the red fern grows.
Right. So hence the challenge of my initial transition to LA
Mm,
and the miracle of me loving it because there was no river where I lived all of a sudden. Because up until that point, everywhere I lived always had a river. I was a river guide briefly. So, like, to be someplace without the water, that kind of water was so different.
mm. I would love to hear more too, as I mentioned before, about how you've fallen in love with LA. But let's get into the episode. What is your I used to think statement?
Yeah. Here's my statement. I used to think life was much more black and white. And now it's just so gray. I think, like, when I think about that, I think of like black and white, right, wrong, and yet now, like, there's so much context for people to understand the decisions they make.
Hmm. As I mentioned earlier, our conversation about development, childhood development and psychology, I think it would be helpful for the audience to hear, is it normal for everyone to go from this transition from black and white to gray? Or do you think it was unique to you or certain people because they were raised? What is your
Mm.
take on that?
Yeah, I think developmentally we go through different phases of that, right? Where things are very concrete when we're younger. And as we grow, like, and our brain expands and we have more insight and more expansive thinking, more critical thinking, I think it grows into more than just like black and white. Though I think there are some people that have more tendency for black and white thinking than others, right?
Okay.
So I still think that even into adulthood, some people are still a little more black and white. I think that's the fun of personality tests that people take and try to
Yeah.
understand themselves and each other in. But I do think there is like that spectrum where when we're younger, it's much more concrete, right? We can't think abstractly.
Right.
We go through this process of like object permanence, even, right? If something's not present, we don't know if it exists or not. And then as we get older, we recognize just because something's not in front of us, we know it still exists. But yeah, I think for me, a lot of that shifting started happening in college
Hmm.
as I started to really look at my experiences growing up. And then I think that continued to be challenged as I moved into my career as a therapist and just that listening to people's stories,
Mm,
I think that process changed me too. Yeah, because it quickly becomes very clear that what seems to be right, there's also the dark side of those things that maybe it's not right or it's not right for everybody in depending on what their circumstances are.
right. You mentioned, I thought it was interesting, certain people have tendencies to retain the concrete black and white thinking. What do you think it is about yourself that helped you make this transition, say, compared to other people?
I think just certain experiences I've had in life changed me, you know. And I think some of it connects to even like so you mentioned I went to Fuller. I think as we continue to grow and grow in our faith and we really look at our theology and unpack our theology, you have to question where did those beliefs come from, but some of the theology that's like American evangelical theology, mm, I don't know. Like I just don't think it aligns with what I've come to understand who God to be.
What are some examples of ideas that you saw
Mm.
as black and white?
Oh gosh.
We're
Uh
getting we're getting spicy here.
yeah. Oh gosh. Oh Patrick, here we go. Well, I think like so I'm gonna move out of some of the theological things for a second and just say
Okay.
like I think a person could go into even work in psychology and think if a parent loves their child, they'll do the things they need
Mm,
to care for them.
okay.
And what I quickly saw is that parents also have their own histories and their own trauma that keep them from being able to make the choices that they really want to make
Hmm.
or that would be aligned with what we would say a loving parent would do. And so quickly came to wrestle with the idea that people do the best that they can with what they know and where they are in life.
Mm,
That's a hard place to try to sit and know that there's really hard things that still happen,
right.
that hurtful things still happen, either to kids or to each other. Yeah.
Were these realizations through mentoring, counseling, certain job?
I would say I think doing my own work, my own therapy, it starts there. And then being a therapist and working with parents or working with kids in foster care system or working with teenagers struggling with substance use,
Mm,
or even adults struggling with substance use who have lost their children because of that. And knowing, like, sitting in the agony with them of what they want to do, what they desire to do, and yet the challenge of doing those things. And so I think that's where it's like things aren't so black and white. Things are so much more complex. There's so many more things that go into behavior, decision making than, oh, I know this thing and that's what should happen.
What is the main age
Mm.
group that you work with?
I've worked with full age range, but I've spent most of my career working with middle school, high school, college age.
Do you find that it's more challenging than counseling adults?
No, I don't. I don't think so. But but if you ask someone else, they would probably say yes, right? I
Okay.
think we all have our tendencies or niches that we really enjoy. I really love that age range. Middle schoolers are a little spicy, and trying to figure out who they are. It's super fun. And I'm loving the middle schoolers at my work right now, but also like really thoughtful about them because it's also this really tender time in life of
Mm,
identity formation, um, and figuring out like which lane you're going to go down and like who your peer group's going to be and how that's going to influence you. And then just high school and college is also just fun because there's just increased insight that comes the older people get. generally speaking. And so that's fun.
When you interact with these kids and even play with them or banter with them, how has the work that you've put into yourself from this black and white to gray transition helped you to help them?
Mm, yeah, hugely. I honestly, as a therapist, as a psychologist, you can't help people do work you haven't done yourself.
Hmm.
And so, like, it was so important to do that work. And really, like, the developmental tasks of this age range, right, is figuring out who am I, where do I belong, and what am I capable of, right? And so I've done a lot of work around those three things. Like, who am I? Like, what is my identity? What gets to define me? And that continues to change at different stages in life, for sure. But there's still core things of like who I am, like what am I capable of, and where do I belong? I think those are questions that are key developmental things, phases in that age range.
Hmm.
But I think those are things we continue into our adulthood too at different seasons. Definitely doing that work, but it applies there.
For yourself, how would you answer those questions?
Hmm. Who am I? I am, hmm, I think you started out well by saying the Pacific Northwest woman who fell in love with LA, surprisingly. I would say I am living full in grace. And I would say I am, oh man, there's so many ways to answer this, right? Like in terms of like I am a daughter, I am a sister, I'm an aunt.
Hmm.
Um, I am, like by role, but also just in terms of like value,
Hmm.
right? I'm a camp director. I I'm adventurous.
Hmm.
I'm an introvert. I would say all of those things are
This
true.
this is a side note, but I recently retook the Myers-Briggs because my fiance and I are doing couples counseling before we get married.
Hmm.
And I'd taken it probably 3 times before this, and every single time I got INFJ. Keep in
Yeah.
mind, keep in mind, I took it once in high school and twice in college. So very formative years in which through which I was changing quite a bit. And I had an identity crisis this one Sunday morning just last month because I quickly took it. I knew I assumed I'm gonna get INFJ and then I'll let my counselors know and that'll be that. And I retook it and I got ENFP
What?
and I spent I spent that morning in church just rethinking my entire life. But
Yeah.
it was a fascinating experience and feeling.
Maybe the podcast has changed you that way.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, I mean, like
Yeah.
I also am an INFJ,
Okay.
and people I have worked with that are very familiar with the Myers Briggs, they always question that I'm a J
Okay.
because of how I work. And I do work in a lot of like when I create a training agenda, I have ideas of what I want to get through and I have time frames. But then sometimes that's not at all what I do. And that's very not a J thing to do. But it makes sense in my head. They question that I'm a J, and I think I still am. But who knows? Maybe more of a P now, just like you.
Maybe you straddle the line between P and J.
Maybe,
Yeah, I know for
maybe.
myself, I will say the P is perceiving, right?
Mhm.
Okay. I think the perceiving part and I guess the spontaneous part has come out as, or I should say, when I feel healthy, when I feel like myself, then I let
Mm-hmm.
myself just do whatever I want and not worry too much about structure.
Yeah, that's why I kind of like the Enneagram. So I would learn the Enneagram before it became like this big hot thing to do
Right.
in the last like 5 years or whatever it's been. I learned the Enneagram back in like 2003,
Okay.
2004. I don't know. And I like it because it talks about what your tendencies are, but it talks about it also like that there's growth and that when you
Mm,
grow, you integrate, right? And that shifts and it gives you more freedom to have that kind of movement. And I think that to me makes a lot of sense because I don't think we are stagnant even when we're growing, we're either moving forward or we're moving backwards in our growth, right? Integration, disintegration, all those pieces. And so that's kind of why I like the Enneagram a little more because it gives space for that
What is your
growth.
Enneagram?
Oh, I'm the hard eight. Definitely an eight.
Okay, eight is, oh gosh, is that adventurous?
The challenger. No,
Okay,
that's a seven. Eight is a challenger.
got it. What are
Yeah.
some words that describe challengers?
I would say a huge part, especially that like connects for me with the eight, is they're very strong in like justice seeking,
Mm,
being an advocate for people. So sometimes they'll be called the advocate as well. They'll be the challenger, the advocate. I think those things are very true of me. And when I move into healthier spaces of that, it integrates into the two, which is the helper. When I disintegrate, I move into a five, which is more of like anger, right? And aggression kind of pieces, not liking being controlled. All of those things completely make sense. Yes.
okay. The advocate comes out
Yeah.
so clearly in camp and that
hmm
whole journey.
And that's what I see in myself too, like in the last many years being in roles of leadership. So like whether it's at camp or in my jobs, I feel like my role is to advocate for the people that I'm leading
Mm,
in my work. And then with Dawn of Hope, certainly, yeah, I think what we do is advocate for our kids and the caregivers and all of that for sure.
right.
Justice, right? Like injustice gets me upset. I think that also is so like that's kind of a funny thing where is this juxtaposition of life's not black and white and yet injustice really upsets me. Which, if I'm thinking about things that are not just, there's clearly a black and white in that. So it's kind of this weird tension to live in, I think.
How is that possible? What does that tension look like?
I think when you sit down and have conversations with people, you start to see the gray or you start to understand why they are the way they are
Mm,
or the choices that they've made, right? What has happened in their life that has led them to where they are. And yet, there's things that are really not okay, right? Like, it's not okay that kids experience abuse. It's not okay that there's systemic racism. It's not okay that
mm,
people weaponize theology to guilt and shame people. It's
mm,
not okay that, so I think that's the tension. And I think I would have and have been in that place of more right and wrong, of judgment of people. And yet
mm.
it's like, yeah, it's just a weird tension to live in for sure.
I know for myself, I would say I have a similar perspective, even in the brief years from high school till now, where I do see the world in more gray. And I know what has happened. I'd be curious if you can relate to this, is when I meet people now, even people that aren't my age, could be the same age as me, who have more black and white thinking, and maybe just in a specific issue, not maybe not entirely, but just a specific topic. I immediately can recognize it because I see that that is how I used to think.
Mhm.
Hence the name of the podcast. But how has your perspective of other people and also the way you treat people now, how has that changed? Especially when you see someone where you can see that they hold the ideals that you used to hold.
It's a good question. I I think there's some space where, like you're saying, like I get where that comes from and can have compassion and grace. And I think there's some times where it's then harder because it's like, whoa, how can you still be in that place, right?
Right.
Because wow, so I think like sometimes it makes it easier because you're like, yeah, I get where that's coming from, and wow, okay, we're still there. Like just even like things around like race
Mm,
or gender that have been pretty hot topics.
right.
and I wouldn't say it like in terms of like hot topics, but people have been more willing or have been more forced to really think about or consider things in terms of race, gender, sexual attraction, some of those things that are pretty hot topics in the church and whatever those things are. Like right now, abortion, women's reproductive rights, all of that, huge. And I think for me, I wrestle with what does pro-life really mean,
Hmm.
right? Like that there's incongruency within some of the thinking. And so that's hard because you can start to see like, well, if we're pro-life, we value this versus that. But what does that really look like? Valuing like how do we value kids in care that are in
Hmm.
foster care? How do we value the parents involved in the system? What does it look like when women have harm done to them, they're assaulted, and they don't have choice in that, and then they also don't have choice.
Hmm.
Like I think so that's where I think something like abortion can feel like that it's right or wrong, but
Hmm.
there's so much complexity to it. There's so much complexity to it. Someone could have a health condition, all of these things. That's wild to me, that
Right.
we can't entrust people with the right to choose something based on what they know, who they are and what their circumstances are.
Hmm. I've had a friend one time, he made a really good point. He said to me one time, taking the phrase pro-life, how as Christians, I consider myself a Christian, how do we truly be pro-life, meaning all forms of life,
Hmm.
and all people in all situations and backgrounds.
Hmm.
And that honestly, that conversation really started a whole line of thinking more in the gray of what does the phrase pro-life really mean. And so yeah, I like the idea that you can keep this sense of justice, but then also think like about the complexities and the nuances of, like you're saying, hot button topics and issues.
Yeah, because it's so much more complex than that.
Hmm. Is there any story specifically in college that you can think of from your experience that continue along your I used to think statement helped you change your mindset and your thinking to more gray?
I don't, yeah, maybe. Yeah, for sure. I mean, at first I was like, I don't know. And that's, yeah, I'm sure there has to be. Like, there's so many things that happened in college. Like, I'm just thinking about all of the experiences I had in college. I think there's some things though about college where beliefs got reinforced that maybe weren't great to get reinforced.
Hmm.
I think it's more after college where some of that thinking started to shift. But certainly, like when I was in college, was studying psychology, also recreation management, and worked at a camp, and that was life changing for me. That the camp I worked at and the people I worked with, they were the most gracious people
Hmm.
I'd ever been around. They were probably the most loving people I'd ever been around. It was very transformational for me to work at camp. And some of the people I worked with are some of my best friends still, like 20 plus years later.
That's awesome.
Yeah, like definitely some of my best friends still. So I think that completely changed, like really understanding more of what grace is versus like having to do things right and be perfect and not make mistakes or always making right choices. Starting to better understand who God is as a loving God. That definitely changed for me in college. And then at that camp, I also encountered, I think I was telling you this story that the girl, she was a camper of ours, where she
Hmm.
was an angel tree kid where both parents were in prison. And that completely changed my life because I spent 3 days with her and came away from that time knowing, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do. Like I had this like radical turn where I was like, I'm done with school. I don't need to do any more school. I'm done with college. All done. And I was like adamant I was not doing grad school, adamant. And those 3 days completely changed that. And I was willing to do grad school because I got to spend those 3 days and saw impact, you know, I could have with another person. And I just knew, like, I walked into our business office and sat down to our business office lady's desk and I said, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with my life. It was like this like most declarative like experience of my life. I'm like, I'm supposed to have a camp for kids that are at risk, you know, and have harder experiences in life. And
Mm,
so that completely changed me. And then that's how I ended up in grad school because I wanted to be prepared in how to do that well.
mm.
And I showed up to grad school. And on that first day, everyone's talking about, well, I'm here because I want to work in mental health. And I'm here because I want to do this in mental health. And I was like, I'm here because I want to have a camp. And my professors just looked at me like I was nuts because I'm talking about wanting to have a camp, but I'm in like a program for marriage and family therapy.
Right.
Um,
You're like, when
and
did
I
we
was
learn
like,
how to
I
tie
don't know.
watermelons?
Seriously, right? I was like, well, like I had a record management degree as well as my psychology degree. And I was like, I don't know, I'm just here. I think this one what I'm supposed to do. And that completely radically changed me. And then going through that training and doing the work and just trusting like I'm gonna do the next thing. I don't know how I'm gonna get there because that felt so far off.
Yeah.
Um, it felt so far off. I just knew like that's what I was going to do. So I'm going to do the next thing that I think is going to get me closer. And 8 years later, it still hadn't happened. And I was like ending up in LA. Like, what is happening with my life? I guess I need to give up that dream of having a camp for kids that were high risk. Like, I held that for a decade.
Mm.
I was like, okay. And I end up in LA and I'm like, okay, I guess not. And then like 3 months later is when I had been involved in like a foster care mentoring program
Okay.
through my church. And then this lady comes and starts talking about Royal Family Kids Camp. And I was like, oh, I know that. We used to host that at the camp I worked at. Those people are wild. I'm like, they're so intense. And I was like, oh, I guess we could do that. And that's how we all came to be in LA. It's like it's just this wild thing of like, I don't know. I don't know how this is gonna happen. I'm gonna just give this up. And in that decade, I did have this brief period where I did wilderness therapy.
Okay.
So it kind of like my friends would joke and say, well, I guess this is your therapy camp. And I'm like, I guess. But that's not really what I meant. That's not what I thought it was. Then it came to be like I never would have imagined this thing that I felt I was supposed to do was going to happen in the city, being from the Pacific Northwest, right? Like having talked about all the places I've lived with rivers and like our family vacation would be camping. Never would imagine that was going to be what would happen in the city. And it's like so amazing to be able to take kids from an urban area
Mm.
who have never been to the mountains, who some of them haven't been out of their neighborhood. So they haven't even been to the ocean, even though it's like relatively close,
Right.
if you have transportation, to be able to take them up into the mountains and have that experience. And so it's pretty amazing how all of that came to be. But to get back to your question, having that encounter with that girl radically changed me. And seeing the role she had because she was placed with her grandma, but her grandma had medical issues, so she cared for her grandma in some ways
Wow.
and a younger sibling. And she was just so anxious. She didn't know where she was, and she was
Mm.
so anxious that her grandma and her sister were okay
Mm.
that she couldn't last more than 3 days at camp, and her social worker had to come get her.
Wow.
But it was a totally like life changing for me.
Do you know where she is now?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I have no idea. Yeah. Thing though, I will tell you that this is like so wild. So for royal family, for the children, all of that, we just did this conference. Like every year we have like this annual conference. And at the lift conference I was at, they had a keynote speaker and she was a camper at a camp that the camp I worked at hosted.
Back in another state?
Yeah, from Washington.
Wow.
And so she's like up doing her keynote speaking, talking about how impactful royal family is, right? And she's describing the camp, she's describing these things, and I was like, she's talking about the camp I was at. I was hosting her. What in the world is happening? And so afterwards, I walked up to her, and it was like, and it was a year I was there, right? So like
Right.
they that particular camp host a royal family.
Mm.
Many years they don't host royal family anymore, so I feel like it's safe to talk about this. But yeah, so I walked up to her. I'm like, "You were at this camp?" She's like, "Yeah, I was." And I'm like, "What year?" And it was like the same year. It was like so wild. Yeah, like oh my goodness.
Did I hear you say wilderness therapy?
Yeah.
Okay. Never heard of that.
No? Oh
No.
my goodness. Yes. So how it works is so there's a few different things. Generally, there will be kids, adolescents. It's almost always adolescents who will go on 21-day backpacking trips.
Wow.
So there's programs that will take kids out into the woods doing therapy. Um, and some programs will use what's called Jeep tracks for their trails. And so people can like drive in and check in on them. And the
Okay.
program I worked at was pure wilderness. We didn't use Jeep tracks. And so yeah, had satellite phones, the whole deal, like it's all the things. So the program I worked at would do 21-day trips. And then if kids needed more time, they would do then 4 weeks of different kinds of things, like 1 week of rock climbing, 1 week of river rafting, 1 week of something else. And then I ultimately really worked at our therapeutic boarding school. So, so if kids really needed longer periods of time for therapy, for intervention, for various reasons, they would live at our boarding school for like 9 to 12 months, which was very wilderness. My office was a yurt and it had a little creek. It was like the best office I've ever had. It was amazing. And we had like the kids would live in these, we call them flats. So it was like wood structure underneath, canvas, and water resistant, like plastic for the roof. So no electricity, no running water. And that's how they lived for a year.
I mean, instead of the break room, you just have all of nature.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So it was that was also very transformational for those kids. So when I started, I did a 21-day trip in the snow.
Oh, wow.
So you snowshoe and you have like snow sleds to pull gear. And I don't like snow, but I wanted this job so badly. So I just pretended I liked snow. I was like, sure, no problem. And I did it. It was great. I learned a new appreciation for the snow in that experience, but that was pretty amazing as well.
I can
Mm.
see how, I mean, you mentioned even before, there are so many kids, at-risk kids or kids in foster care who have never been to the beach or the woods. I can't imagine 21 straight days. I
Mhm.
mean, I'm sure they remember that for the rest of their lives.
And it might be a positive memory for them, or it might be a really hard
Right.
memory for them, right? It's
Exactly. It
like
could
you're
go
not
either
gonna
way.
because that was hard. It was hard.
Right. I had a list that I sent over of a few questions I wanted to ask specifically about, I guess, development during adolescence. And
Mhm.
we'll just hit a couple because I did send quite a few. I was curious, is this a myth or is this true that our brains are done developing at 25? Because I've definitely had people joke with me that my brain is not done yet because I'm currently 24.
Yes, you're not done yet. And it's not that your brain stopped developing, it's really more about like the fullness of your brain
Okay.
being like your frontal cortex, right?
Okay.
Is like your executive functioning. That is what continues to develop until you're 24, 25-ish. Because then what starts to happen is like in adolescence between like 12 and 24, you're starting to like your brain starts to do this process called pruning where
Okay.
it's getting rid of neural pathways that you're not utilizing. but also myelination, which then makes the pathways that are being developed even stronger and more efficient and faster. But your brain always can learn new things, can grow, but the more you do something, it's like creating a stronger pathway for that thing.
Okay. Is there anything where once you let those pathways die, you just can't bring it back? I mean, I've heard, I guess, that kind of narrative around language and music.
You know, I think there's competing ideas, to be
Okay.
honest. I think what everyone would agree is that it's harder. It's so much easier to
Right.
learn music, to learn languages when you're younger because all of that pruning hasn't happened, but it's still doable.
Okay.
It's still doable.
All right. So it doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Oh, of course not. Of course not. I think that's when we stop learning, when we stop using those parts of our brains, that's
Mm,
actually what contributes more to dementia later in
mm,
life. And so like that's where a lot of like physical activity or doing like brain puzzles helps keep dementia away.
okay.
When my mom retired, I told her she needed to get a hobby and she had to do like challenging things for her brain every day. Like, look, you're not going to be working, so your brain, you got to keep it. We got to keep your brain active.
Is it like the Sudoku in the daily paper or
Yes,
okay.
she does do a lot of Sudoku. Actually,
That's what I
now it's
always
too easy for
picture.
her, so we have to get her new puzzle.
Oh
Yeah,
wow.
have to get her new puzzles because
That's
too
great.
easy for her now. Yeah, but yeah, your brain continues to develop. But also, like, there's this idea of neuroplasticity, right?
Okay.
Where have you heard that phrase?
I've heard the phrase.
So neuroplasticity says that we can like our brains are not static. Like they can always be growing, they can heal.
Mm,
So like even when I think about that in terms of trauma, the brain is so impacted. Like the you can see scans of people's brains and the different parts that light up or not that have experienced lots of trauma. Like that even in that, like the brain can heal, the body can heal from trauma
wow.
because body or trauma gets embodied, right? Like stored in the body,
Mm,
and that the brain can heal even from trauma, and the brain and like it shifts as well. So yeah, it's kind of amazing actually.
that is very encouraging to hear.
Yeah, I think some of those things like in terms of like science and what we can know, to me becomes even more evidence that there's a creator
Mm,
and that there's this intelligent design because of how the body wants to heal itself.
mm. One of
Because
the phrases from camp, training from camp last year that I still remember vividly is I think one of the slides you had up said, these children are not permanently damaged.
mm, mm,
And I guess in some ways it should be obvious, but I just remember when you said that and we were talking about it in training, it just does so much harm. I think even when I think about myself, if I see myself as permanently damaged, then I won't even try. Like I won't even try the Sudoku or the new language or
mm,
music or to heal from that trauma or to repair the damage from that relationship. And so even just yeah, hearing that out loud, saying that out loud it was very cool to see at camp.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, and I say that like from watching people, right? But
Mm,
also experiencing my own, like having experienced my own trauma and seeing how that changes, because you start to then think about like attachment and attachment styles. And there's different attachment styles, but I think the thing that aligns with what you're talking about is this idea of earned attachment. So if someone has anxious attachment or avoidant attachment, in healthy relationships and through healing, they develop this thing that we now refer to as earned attachment.
mm,
Like, I don't, like, I can trust that this person is safe
mm.
and I can be attached to them. I think that's example of that as well. Like, and the brain then starts to shift.
Right.
That it doesn't have to be in that fight or flight or stuck in the amygdala.
I mentioned this
Mm,
in our initial call a few days ago, but this podcast is really aimed towards people between the ages of 18 to mid 30s who I know because I'm in that stage now where there's a lot of black and white to gray. There's a lot of healing. There's a lot of questioning. In another episode, a friend described it as deconstructing and reconstructing.
Mhm.
And so, what would your, not even just from a psychologist perspective, but just as someone who has been through all these stages of life, what are some tips to undo harmful behaviors and habits and mindsets? How did you even personally get through your 20s?
It's a good question. I would say, okay, so I think you asked so many questions. I'm trying to decide which one I want to answer first. So, how do we undo harmful behaviors? Let's start there.
Okay.
So, here's my stance on behavior. All behavior serves a function. And you've actually probably heard all of these things from me because I talk about it this way at camp, even. Like, I think all behavior, whether you're talking about a 9-year-old or a 25-year-old, it serves a function for somebody. It's meeting some kind of need.
Hmm.
And a person has learned to meet that need with that particular behavior. And so you have to, if it becomes where it's something harmful, you have to figure out how you meet that need differently in a not harmful way.
Hmm.
It it sounds simple, but it's actually really challenging. And with certain behaviors, so this is like I had no idea I was going to talk about the brain so much today, but I'm going to. With certain behaviors, it triggers a dopamine, which then is hugely reinforcing of that behavior. So gambling, pleasure seeking behaviors,
Hmm.
like triggers dopamine. So you have to find something that's equally effective with that dopamine hit would provide to change that behavior.
Hmm.
That's where addiction comes in and is so challenging. I always tell people, they want a teenager to stop using drugs. Cool, great, probably not the best thing for them. And it's serving a function for them. It's helping them cope in some way. It's doing something for them. And so, what are you going to provide in exchange for the drugs that's going to equally meet that need or be even stronger? That's how you're going to get that teenager to stop using drugs.
Hmm. Yeah, I've heard it said that the definition of surrender is being willing to make a replacement or an exchange.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's a great way to summarize that. Does that answer that question? I think it does.
Yeah.
I think I think about that in terms of like relationships, and it's more complex, I think, in relationships. Like
Hmm.
if you're choosing relationships that are challenging or or not healthy for you, I think it then goes back to those questions we talked about, like who am I?
Hmm.
It extends into quality in relationship. I think that's a huge piece of that transition in relationships in that phase of life. I think even people that are older, if they didn't learn it then, they have to learn it when they're older. Like it's okay. Like having needs doesn't mean that you're needy. Those aren't the same thing.
I like
Um,
that. Having needs doesn't mean you're needy. Hmm.
and that you get to ask for what you want or what you need. That's a radical thought for some people.
Yeah, I don't remember who I heard this from, but I think either a counselor or a therapist say that there are two types of people that he's worked with. Those who want chocolate cake but shouldn't have it, and those who want chocolate cake but actually should have it, not never letting themselves experience pleasure or have their needs met. Not that chocolate cake is necessarily a need, but the analogy only goes so
Mhm.
far. And that
Yeah,
really
I get.
that really resonated with me. I think there are a lot of pleasures that I grew up thinking, oh, I don't deserve that. I don't deserve to take a break. I need to do homework 7 days a week, whatever it may be, even as a kid, thinking those kinds of things. And yeah, I'm learning to be open to having the chocolate cake.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I think that's something I continue to learn,
Mm,
like in different ways, right? I think a message I got a lot was to not be a burden, whether that
mm,
was intentional or not,
right.
to not be a burden, because there was a lot of I would say, stress burden in my family growing up.
Mm.
Growing up, like my parents divorced when I was young. I grew up living next door to my grandparents, but just to not cause trouble, I think, you know. And so that I think that starts to translate for me in like you can ask for what you need, don't be a troublemaker. That that led to like the kinds of decisions I would make and having to learn. Like I was doing this rock climb once and it was not great. It was a multi-pitch climb
Mm.
and I had just injured my back, so I probably should have been doing a multi-pitch climb, but I didn't know that's what this place like I was doing working for the summer. I didn't know they were taking us to a multi-pitch climb. And and they also provided the rock shoes. I had my own like harness, but they provided the rock shoes. And I was like, okay. I'm like, well, and I told them, oh, these shoes do not fit. And they're like, no, they're supposed to be small and tight. I'm like, no, I get it. I know how they're supposed to fit.
Right.
These shoes are too small. They're like, no, you're wrong. Okay. So I struggled. It was a 5 pitch climb. I only ended up doing 3 because on the 3rd pitch, I was like, the shoes were too small. I ended up losing multiple toenails.
Oh my
I could
goodness.
I could hardly walk. I had fallen once. I was like totally like beat up once. And I finally had this one of the staff ask me, "Well, what do you need? What do you need right now?" And I just was like so caught off guard by being asked that. I was like,
Mm.
I was 21 probably. And the energy and like the energy of this group was so different than the camp group I had worked for.
Mm.
And so I was just so caught off guard by someone actually asking me what I needed because I had been so invalidated up to that point. And I was like, I don't know. I think I need to be done. I don't think I can finish.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they're like, okay. And the guy was like really great about it. And I ended up having to hike down with like I was a mess. But yeah, like learning that it's okay to have needs, I think is a radical idea as well.
Yeah. You were like, I think I need a couple new toenails.
Actually, I tried to glue them on,
Okay.
like, because you know, you can like super glue some things. Like when you get cuts, you can super glue it and different things. Because we were going to spend the next days in the river, and I couldn't be on the river if I had a messed up toes
Okay.
because I'd get infection. And I was like, I didn't want to miss out on the river time. Oh my god. Yeah. Talk about like trying to not have need. Mhm.
I love it.
That was that was a tough summer for me because it was just such difference from the other people I'd been working in recreation with. So
Hmm.
it wasn't okay to have needs with them.
Right. Yeah. Save people.
Mhm.
Is there anything else as we wrap up that you wanted to add about how to thrive in your adolescent years?
Oh gosh. It's funny you use the word thrive because that's actually what I did my dissertation on. We didn't even talk about this. My dissertation was completely about contributors to adolescent thriving.
So I'm assuming you have some
Um,
things to share.
so, I did a lot of research on this, but I did it in the context of relationships
Hmm.
and like how you promote like thriving through relationship. And so, like the research shows that if an adolescent has 3 or more adults in their life beyond their parents
Hmm.
that are supports for them, they have the highest likelihood of thriving. Also, if they are challenged to grow, if they have people who are kind of like their cheerleaders, if they develop what's called a spark, this is like a particular interest for them, and they learn how to develop that spark, they have higher levels of thriving. So for me in high school, that was journalism. I thought I was going to be a
Hmm.
journalist. That is not what I did. But I had this teacher that really supported that. And I ended up like being able to interview Tom Brokaw because I had this professor or this high school teacher that was like, sure, you can do anything. Okay, cool. And I was just thought I could. I tried to interview Oprah. I tried to interview our governor. I just was going to try. I got told no on Oprah, but Tom Brokaw came to town and I got to interview him. So, things like that, developing a spark, having the people.
Mm,
And I think a huge thing in that is also like when I think about adolescence prior to like 18, a
mhm,
huge piece is when adults start to share power with an adolescent, helping them learn how to make choices. One, so that you feel like you can make a choice and that it's okay to make mistakes. Because
mhm.
you learn how to bounce back from the mistake, right? So things along those lines. But relationships are such a key part of the thriving.
Yeah, I think there's that Harvard class on happiness, and I think I
Mm,
remember that was their essentially the summary of all the research, decades of research was relationships. That makes
mm,
sense.
mm. Yeah, I mean, I think about it too, like in context, like our bodies thrive, like our health thrives
Mm,
because of relationships, and I think about like epigenetics, where your genes only express themselves because of the environment that they are in, whether that's the food or the amount of sleep or the exercise or like the actual environment you live in and the amount of like pollution or whatever, right? Like your
mm.
genes only express because of that. And I think that's true of us as just human, that we develop because of what we are immersed in and
I
who we are immersed around.
I didn't know that. I've never heard of that idea.
Mhm.
That's pretty cool.
It's really wild. Like I told you that I got diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder
Mm,
when I was like 34, 35. And I think I had the genetic tendency for that, but it
mm,
only became expressed, I think, because of the amount of stress I was under at that point
mm.
in my life.
Right.
And I think it all just collided. And then it just caused that genetic thing with the autoimmune to express. I would like for it to unexpress, but it's still there. Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting.
Yeah. I wanted
Hmm.
to take some time to do some shout out for camp.
Yeah. So we sponsor camp through a nonprofit called Dawn of Hope, which came from, you know, some of the story I shared earlier about being in LA and all of a sudden being part of this like foster care mentoring program that has morphed. And then a group of us started the nonprofit. And so we sponsor a week of camp for kids who are in LA County foster care between the ages of 7 and 11, sometimes 6 and 12 if there's siblings that are involved, or a returning camper to graduate when they're 12. So it's 1 week, and we go, we meet at a central location. We take the kids up on a charter bus. You all greet us with the royal welcome. And then these kids have a life changing week. And I think the volunteers have a life changing week as well. But camp is for the camper. So we
Yep.
focus on that.
Camp is for the camper.
Yeah. So people, if they want to know more, they can go to our website, dawnofhopela.org is where you can find us if you want to connect with us and get more information. I would like to say this. The week of camp, like it is not like traditional camp.
Mm,
And it's like our ratios, we take twice as many adults as we take kids,
mm,
just so that it is such a unique and special experience. We do things similar to normal camp, like traditional camp, and there's some things that are different. My favorite thing we do is variety show Wednesday night when all the kids are on stage and they do different things. Like it is that moment when those kids know that they are important, that they get to be kids, and that they have something we are going to celebrate. Some skill, whether it's blowing bubbles or doing a skit or whatever it is, some sort of dance. I don't care what it is. They have something that we're going to celebrate about them. And
mm.
that is really the heart of what we do.
My personal favorite is one group singing Feliz Navidad for 10 straight minutes while dancing on stage in the middle of June.
I mean, I don't know. I think you in some costume doing a wild skit last summer was also pretty epic.
That's true. I was in a pink unicorn costume.
You were, which is pretty epic.
Thank you so much
Yeah.
for your time and your heart, Maria.
Yeah,
I
thank you,
really
Patrick.
appreciate it. Hey, thanks for listening to this episode and for taking the time to listen to Maria's story as well as hear more about camp. Thank you in advance to those who are able to contribute to camp. It's not an exaggeration when I say this week is truly life-changing for so many kids. I also wanted to announce that I have created an Instagram account for the podcast. Simply look up I Used to Think Podcast and you should find it pretty easily. I hope to post behind the scenes content as well as clips from previous episodes and future episodes and whatever else I can think of. Thanks in advance for taking the time to follow. I look forward to seeing you guys in the next episode.